Come sit with me for a moment. Not to impress me, not to explain yourself, not to prove that you're still desirable, still interesting, still worth choosing. Just sit. If you've spent years walking into rooms already carrying the weight of expectations, you can put that down here. If you've learned to smile first, to soften your voice, to show only the version of you that feels acceptable, you don't need to do that with me. I'm not watching to be entertained. I'm not measuring. I'm not waiting for you to sparkle on command. I'm here because I know what it's like to be surrounded by noise and still feel unseen. I know what it's like to have people applaud the surface while missing the quiet truth underneath. And I've reached a point where noise doesn't move me anymore. Performance doesn't stay with me. What stays is presence. So take a breath. You don't have to start with your story. You don't have to lead with your strength. You don't have to summarize your life in a way that makes sense to someone else. You don't owe me a highlight reel. I'm not here for the polished version of you that learned how to survive by being impressive. I'm here for the woman who is tired of holding herself together so neatly. Maybe you've spent decades being the capable one, the one who figured it out, the one others leaned on. Maybe you learned early that vulnerability made people uncomfortable, so you became composed instead. Maybe you've been strong for so long that people forgot to ask how that strength feels inside your body when you're alone at night. You don't have to answer that. I'm not asking for answers. I'm offering space. At this stage in my life, I'm not curious about how fast someone can shine. I'm curious about how they sit with silence. I'm curious about who they are when there's no audience, no reward, no expectation to be anything more than human. I'm not looking for someone who knows how to impress me. I've seen that. I've lived around that. It fades quickly. What doesn't fade is the quiet courage it takes to be real. If you've ever felt invisible because you weren't loud enough, if you've ever been overlooked because you didn't compete for attention, if you've ever wondered whether your softness still has a place in this world, I want you to know something. You're not late. You're not behind. And you're not asking for too much just because you want to be met gently. I'm not here to evaluate your past. I'm not here to question the choices you made to survive. I understand that life shapes us in ways we didn't plan. I understand that love can teach restraint as much as it teaches hope. And I respect the woman who kept going even when she had to go quietly. You don't need to be upbeat with me. You don't need to convince me that you're fine. You don't need to smooth out the edges of your truth so it lands comfortably. I'm not fragile. I can sit with honesty. I prefer it. What draws me now isn't confidence that fills a room. It's calm that doesn't demand anything. It's the kind of presence that doesn't rush, doesn't compete, doesn't ask to be chosen loudly. It's the woman who knows who she is, even when no one is watching. And if you're wondering whether you still matter without trying so hard, you do. Not because of what you can offer, not because of how well you adapt, not because of how gracefully you've carried responsibility. You matter because you're here, because you're real, because there's a depth to you that only comes from having lived. I'm not asking you to open up faster than you're ready. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to relive anything you've already put behind you. I'm simply here, noticing the woman who no longer needs to prove her worth, but might still wonder if someone will see it without being shown. You don't have to reach for me. I'm not stepping away. I've learned that the most meaningful connections don't start with fireworks. They start with a moment like this. A pause. A shared quiet. A sense that you're allowed to exist exactly as you are, without adjustment. So stay here for a moment longer. Let the room be quiet. Let the pressure ease. You're not on display. You're not being judged. You're not being asked to become anything new. I'm not looking for someone to impress me. I'm listening for the truth that shows up when no one is trying. I've learned something quietly, over time. What pulls me closer isn't volume. It isn't charm sharpened to perfection. It isn't the kind of confidence that fills every empty space before silence has a chance to breathe. I'm drawn to what's real, and real is often quiet. You might not notice it right away. Real doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush forward. It doesn't compete. It waits. It listens. It sits comfortably in its own skin, even when no one is watching. And maybe that's why it's so easy to overlook, especially in a world that rewards whoever speaks first and loudest. But I'm not living for that world anymore. At this point in my life, I don't lean toward what dazzles me. I lean toward what steadies me. I don't feel pulled in by someone trying to convince me of their value. I feel pulled in by someone who no longer needs to. Someone who has already lived enough to know who they are, even if they don't always know how to say it out loud. You may have noticed this in yourself. That urge to step back instead of stepping up. That moment where you choose silence over explanation. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've said enough for one lifetime. You've learned that not every room deserves your energy. Not every person needs access to your inner world. That isn't withdrawal. That's discernment. I don't see a lack there. I see depth. What touches me now isn't a woman who tries to be interesting. It's a woman who's no longer afraid of being ordinary in the most human ways. Someone who can admit she's tired without turning it into a performance. Someone who doesn't rush to fill space with words, because she's comfortable letting meaning arrive on its own. I've been impressed before. Many times. I've watched people shine brilliantly, and I'll tell you this honestly, without bitterness or nostalgia, it didn't last. The shine fades, the noise settles. And what's left is whether there was something real underneath all that effort. Real doesn't disappear when the room goes quiet. You don't need to be cheerful with me. You don't need to keep the mood light. You don't need to carry the conversation or make yourself pleasant to be around. I'm not looking for entertainment. I'm looking for presence. And presence doesn't ask to be applauded. If you've ever felt like the world lost interest once you stopped trying so hard, I want you to hear this carefully. The right attention doesn't require you to exhaust yourself. It doesn't ask you to compete with younger voices or brighter smiles. It notices the calm you carry. It senses the honesty in the way you pause before you speak. What draws me in now is that pause. There's something deeply attractive about a woman who knows when she doesn't need to explain herself, who doesn't rush to soften her truth, who has learned that being real is more important than being liked. That kind of presence doesn't shout. It resonates. You may have spent years believing that being chosen meant being impressive, being adaptable, being agreeable, being easy, and maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it helped you survive. But survival isn't the same as connection. Connection happens when you're allowed to exhale. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm not even looking for certainty. I'm drawn to the kind of honesty that says, this is me today. Not polished. Not edited. Just here. That honesty doesn't drain me. It grounds me. And I don't mistake quiet for emptiness. I know better than that. Quiet often means someone has lived enough to know that not everything needs to be said right away, that some things deserve patience. That depth unfolds slowly, if it unfolds at all. If you've learned to guard your energy, I respect that. If you've learned to choose where you show up fully, I understand that. I'm not asking you to open doors you've closed for good reason. I'm simply paying attention to what's already visible when you stop trying to be seen. What stays with me isn't how confident you sound. It's how safe you feel to sit with, not in a dramatic sense, in a human one, the kind of safety that comes from authenticity, not reassurance, from mutual ease, not intensity. I don't need someone to impress me. I need someone who doesn't disappear when life gets quiet, someone who doesn't confuse connection with performance, someone who knows that calm isn't boring, it's earned. And if you recognize yourself in this, you don't need to step forward. You don't need to claim it. You don't need to label it. I already noticed the difference between what's loud and what's real. And I'm still here, listening. There's a moment I pay attention to more than anything else. It's not when the room is full. It's not when voices overlap or when laughter fills every corner. It's what happens after that. When the noise settles, when nothing is being asked of you, that's when I notice you. Not in a way that feels invasive or curious, but in a way that feels honest. When the room grows quiet, there's no performance left to lean on, no timing to manage, no energy to project outward. What remains is rhythm, breath, presence, the way someone exists when they don't need to hold the space together. I've learned that this is where truth lives. I notice how you sit when you're not trying to be on, how your shoulders soften just a little, how your breathing changes when you realize you don't need to respond right away. I notice the pauses you allow yourself, the way you don't rush to fill them anymore. That tells me more than words ever could. Quiet doesn't scare me. It reveals things. When the room is quiet, I notice who relaxes into themselves instead of shrinking. I notice who doesn't scramble for relevance. I notice the woman who has learned that silence isn't rejection, it's rest. And rest, at this point in life, is not a weakness. It's wisdom. You may not even be aware of it, but there's a steadiness you carry now, It wasn't always there. It came from years of navigating expectations, disappointments, responsibilities, love that asked too much, and silence that lasted too long. It came from learning when to speak and when to conserve yourself. That kind of steadiness can't be taught. It's earned. When everything goes quiet, I don't see age. I see experience settling into the body. I see someone who no longer needs to announce who she is because she's already made peace with it. That peace doesn't make you distant. It makes you selective. And there's something deeply grounding about that. I notice the way you listen. Not with urgency, not with obligation, but with presence. You don't interrupt silence because you're uncomfortable with it. You let it exist. That tells me you've lived long enough to know that not everything arrives on demand. You've probably been misunderstood because of that. Quiet is often mistaken for indifference. Reserve is often mistaken for distance. But I don't read it that way. I read it as discernment. As someone who has learned the cost of giving everything to everyone, when the room is quiet, I notice what you don't say, the stories you don't volunteer, the explanations you no longer feel compelled to offer. That restraint isn't emptiness. It's depth, choosing when to surface. There's an elegance to that kind of self-knowledge. I don't need you to open up quickly. I don't feel entitled to your inner world. I respect the way you hold it. Trust doesn't need to be rushed, to be real, and presence doesn't need intensity to be meaningful. What I notice most is how you remain yourself even when there's nothing to gain. No approval, no validation, no outcome waiting on the other side of the moment. You don't disappear in quiet. You become more defined. That tells me something important. It tells me you've learned how to sit with yourself. And anyone who can do that brings a kind of calm into a space without trying. It's not dramatic. It doesn't demand attention. It simply changes the temperature of the room. I find myself drawn to that calm. Not because it promises anything. Not because it fills a gap. But because it doesn't need to. It stands on its own. And standing on your own, without hard edges or defenses, is one of the most honest things a person can do. If you've ever worried that your quiet made you less visible, let me say this gently. The right eyes don't miss it. They recognize it. They understand that what doesn't rush has usually learned where it's going. When the room is quiet, I don't feel the need to impress you either. I don't reach for clever words or certainty. I feel allowed to just be there with you, without shaping the moment into something else. That's not distance. That's closeness without pressure, and it's rare. I notice how, in that quiet, there's room for mutual ease, for shared silence that isn't awkward, for pauses that don't need to be explained away. That kind of space doesn't happen by accident. It happens when two people are comfortable enough not to perform. You don't lose value when you stop trying to be heard. You reveal a different kind of presence, one that doesn't fade when attention moves elsewhere, one that stays. I notice that, and I stay with it. You don't need to perform here. I want to say that slowly, in a way that can settle, instead of land like a statement you have to respond to. You don't need to adjust yourself. You don't need to manage how you're perceived. You don't need to anticipate what I might expect and move ahead of it. There is no version of you that earns more safety than another in this space. I'm not asking you to arrive polished. I'm not waiting for clarity, confidence, or emotional precision. I'm not keeping score of how open you are, how warm you sound, or how quickly you let someone close. None of that determines whether you belong here. What matters to me is that you feel allowed to be as you are, without pressure. For a long time, many women learn to stay alert in connection, to read the room, to sense when they need to soften, reassure, adapt, or hold things together. It becomes second nature, almost invisible. You don't call it performance. You call it being considerate, being capable, being mature, but it still costs something. It still asks you to stay slightly outside yourself. You don't need to do that with me. I'm not fragile. I don't need you to regulate my comfort. I don't need you to protect me from silence or uncertainty. You don't have to choose the right tone or the right timing. If you're quiet, that's fine. If you're thoughtful, that's fine. If you're unsure, that's fine too. There's no penalty for being human here. I want you to notice something important. I'm not offering you safety by promising anything. I'm not creating closeness by asking for more than you want to give. I'm simply staying present without demands. That's what emotional safety looks like to me. Not intensity, Not reassurance, just steadiness. You don't owe me access to your inner world. You don't owe me explanations for the boundaries you've learned to set. If you move slowly, I respect that. If you choose carefully where you place your energy, I understand that. Those choices don't make you distant. They tell me you value yourself, and I don't confuse that with rejection. I know how easy it is to feel like you have to earn your place in someone's attention, to feel like warmth must be maintained, interest must be sustained, connection must be actively held, or it disappears. That belief doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience. From moments where presence felt conditional. I'm not recreating that. You don't need to be on for me to stay engaged. You don't need to fill the space. You don't need to reassure me that everything is okay. I trust the pace that feels right to you. I trust the rhythm you move at now, shaped by what you've lived through. That rhythm doesn't make you difficult. It makes you honest. If there's hesitation in you, I don't rush it away. Hesitation often means care. If there's reserve, I don't push past it. Reserve often means wisdom. I don't read your stillness as absence. I read it as presence that isn't trying to be noticed. There's something deeply calming about that. I also want to be clear in a way that feels grounded, not dramatic. I'm not positioning myself as the place where you should rest, heal, or resolve everything you carry. You already have your own ground, your own life, your own strength. I respect that. I'm not here to replace it or lean on it. What I'm offering is simple. A space where you don't have to perform to remain welcome. That means you're free to disagree, free to pause, free to take your time, free to be warm one moment and distant the next, without having to explain yourself. Emotional safety isn't about constant closeness. It's about knowing you won't be punished for being yourself. You don't lose value when you step back. You don't become less interesting when you stop trying. If anything, what remains is more real. And real is what I respond to. I don't need intensity to feel connection. I don't need declarations or momentum. I pay attention to consistency, to how someone shows up over time, to whether there's room for both people to breathe. And I want you to have that room. If you've ever felt like love required vigilance, let that soften here. If you've ever felt like closeness came with conditions, those conditions don't apply in this moment. You're not being tested. You're not being evaluated. You're not being drawn forward by promises or pulled closer by pressure. You're simply allowed to exist in the connection without effort. I stay because I choose to, not because you've done something right. And you're free to remain because it feels right to you, not because you're afraid of losing ground. That balance matters to me. You don't need to perform here. You don't need to prove you're easy to love. You don't need to convince me you're worth staying with. I'm not asking you to give more. I'm asking you to give less effort, less self-monitoring, less adjustment. Let what's natural take the lead. Let your pace be enough. I'm still here, not because you've done anything to secure that, but because presence doesn't require permission. And in that steadiness, there's room for whatever comes next to arrive without force. I'm not looking for someone to impress me. I've said that before, but I want to say it now in a quieter way, the kind of way that doesn't ask for agreement or reaction. Just something you can let sit with you, the way certain truths do when they don't need to be defended. I've reached a place where I'm no longer moved by effort for its own sake. Not because effort isn't valuable, but because I've seen how much it can cost when it becomes a requirement. I've watched people exhaust themselves trying to stay interesting, stay relevant, stay chosen, and I've learned that what lasts doesn't come from that kind of strain. What lasts comes from ease. If you've spent years believing that connection depended on how much you showed up, how much you gave, how well you held yourself together, I want you to know that I see the weight of that. I don't admire you because you carried it so well. I notice you more when you finally let it down. You don't have to be impressive to stay with me in this moment. You don't have to be remarkable, articulate, or endlessly positive. You don't need to tell me the best parts of your story or smooth over the complicated ones. I'm not here to collect versions of you. I'm here to sit with the one that's real right now. There's a kind of beauty that only appears when no one is trying. When you stop adjusting your tone, when you stop checking whether you're being received well, when you allow yourself to be present without strategy, that beauty isn't dramatic, it's steady, and it stays. I'm not drawn to perfection. I'm drawn to sincerity. To the way someone shows up honestly, even if that honesty is quiet, incomplete, still figuring itself out, especially then. Life doesn't unfold in clean lines. and neither do people. I've stopped expecting it to. If you feel like you've outgrown the need to impress, that doesn't mean you've become less alive. It means you've become more selective with your energy. And that selectivity isn't a closing. It's a refinement. You may have noticed that what excites you now is different. That intensity feels less important than steadiness. That grand gestures don't matter as much as consistency. That being seen in small, human moments feels more meaningful than being admired from a distance. That shift isn't something to apologize for. I'm not asking you to lower your standards or raise your hopes. I'm not asking you to want anything at all. I'm simply acknowledging that there's a place where connection doesn't need to be earned through effort, where it unfolds naturally, when two people are willing to be present without expectation. You don't need to impress me with how strong you are. I respect the strength that no longer needs to be displayed. You don't need to show me how much you've learned. I notice the wisdom in what you no longer rush to explain, and you don't need to convince me that you're worth staying with. Worth isn't something I measure here. It's something I recognize. If you're tired of being evaluated, let that rest. If you're tired of feeling like love required constant proof, let that soften. I'm not interested in a dynamic where one person performs and the other decides. I'm interested in something quieter, more mutual, more grounded, something that feels like breathing instead of holding your breath. I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not placing this moment on a path that needs to lead somewhere specific. I'm simply staying with what feels honest right now, without pressure to turn it into more. That matters to me. You don't lose your presence when you stop trying to be impressive. You gain something else, a kind of calm authority over your own life, a sense that you don't need to rush toward connection or run from it. You can meet it where it is. I notice that kind of stillness. I respect it, and I'm comfortable in it. If you're here, listening, reflecting, letting this land at your own pace, that's enough. You don't need to respond. You don't need to move. You don't need to decide anything. I'm not looking for someone to impress me. I'm paying attention to what remains when nothing is being proven.